20 years ago, in October of the year 2000, the 6th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles was released, along with this box set. Now, while I was too busy playing Dungeons & Dragons to have bought this or played this, I do still have a little bit of nostalgia for it. I can remember when I was going into hobby shops to buy Magic cards or look at Dungeons & Dragons books. Let's be honest, I wasn't really buying very many of them. I remember this being on the shelves, and I remember the owner of my local hobby shop trying in vain to paint all of the whites and reds on the Empire soldiers. It's really hard to paint white, so I don't blame him. So I never owned it, but I do have a little bit of nostalgia for it, and when I saw it on eBay for a pretty okay deal, and it looks like it's complete in box, I decided it might be worth picking up for, what do you call this holiday season? Empire-tober? Something that starts with O? I don't know. Anyway, I thought it might be worth doing for an October video because it just seemed sort of festive. So today we're going to unbox this set, talk about the historical context, and we're going to have a special guest on today to tell you a little bit about what it was like to be around when this was actually coming out in stores, and who knows, we'll see what happens. Anything could happen. Now, while this box is not brand new, I did buy it from a reputable source who insisted it was complete in box and that no underhanded deals were going on. This box retailed for $74.99 in US dollars back in the day, which in today's dollars, along with inflation, is about, I have it written down over here, $113 in US dollars, which seems like a huge bargain to me personally, when you compare it to something like Soul Wars, which is the modern equivalent. Just considering the amount of models that are inside, plus it comes with a piece of really fun cardboard terrain, as well as the main rulebook, like not an abridged version, but the full main rulebook. So I feel like it's actually a pretty good deal for what you're getting. For the full historical experience, I also purchased the October 2000 edition of White Dwarf magazine and the Empire Army book that came out at the same time. So you can imagine, or I can imagine, the fantasy of having been very rich or having had very rich parents who didn't mind me playing board games that encouraged satanic activity. It was pretty fun to open this thing up, and aside from minor cosmetic damage to the cardboard, it really did give me that sort of new product rush that I sometimes get when I'm buying a new unboxed model kit and I'm excited to put it together. And from what I can tell by checking online, I think this is a complete set and nothing's missing. Here you can see me unboxing it and what it looks like when I spread the contents out over an entire table. It's a lot of stuff. In total, what we're getting is 7 sprues of orc models, plus 6 mini sprues for the boars, 7 sprues of Empire models, plus 2 mini sprues for the horse, 2 plastic sprues of plastic frames for the terrain piece, 1 sprue of spell templates, 2 rulers, a handful of dice, as well as a ton of plastic square bases, the unpunched cardboard terrain piece, the rulebook, and a bit of miscellaneous paperwork. Paperwork number 1 is a getting started guide, and I found it was actually pretty helpful. The first 3 pages give you an example of gameplay so that you can get playing right away. I always appreciate it when games include these things because no one wants to go and read an entire rulebook, they just want to start playing the game right away. This is followed by 5 pages of assembly instructions for all of the models. Some of the instructions were not quite as clear as modern instructions, and I had to do some interpretation, but overall, I kind of appreciate how these models are more like toys than the more modern figurines that we get from Games Workshop. There's a lot of just like giving you the parts and letting you do your own thing with them. The second piece of paperwork we're getting here is called World of Hobby Games. As we open it up, it shows us what a Warhammer Fantasy battle might actually look like, which I think is pretty helpful. Although I'm sure very few hobbyists have 2 well-painted armies and a beautiful table of terrain like this, these pictures were kind of like the platonic ideal that some of us strove to reach, the fantasy that was being sold to us. Well, not me in particular, because I wasn't into Warhammer at the time, but sold to the collective us. Unlike some other hobbies, the point here was the spectacle as much as the gameplay itself, and I think that is kind of interesting. On the inside, there's a little bit of description about the hobby. One of the interesting things here is that the painting aspect is framed as almost like a chore. This stands in stark contrast to the marketing today, which markets the painting as something that it's assuming you're going to want to do if you're going to do this hobby. Beyond this, there's some mail order info as well as a special offer for a hobby starter kit. I know in one of Guy's recent videos he tried sending away for this, so I'm not going to bother doing the same thing, and I'm just going to wait to see if he has any success with his sending his away. Also included, there are 2 customer response cards, which enters you into a monthly draw for prizes, but I'm assuming the real purpose here was to enter you into the database to send you mail order catalogs and things like that. The final bit of paperwork is a massive poster-sized mail order catalog. It shows you, in grayscale, many of the models available to order, what price they are, and what number to call if you want to order them. At this point, Games Workshop did have a website, but it was very primitive, and it seems like mail order was still the main way that they expected you to order things. I know some of you can't imagine this, but online shopping was not always the default. We used to have to actually go places. The rulebook is kind of interesting, and I think tells us a lot about the time period in which it was made. It's one of those old books that, in order to save on costs, it's mostly black and white with only a few pages printed in color, although the color pages do look nice. It's interesting to me that most of the color pages that we have here are not used to show off 2D paintings or anything, but are instead used to show off painted models or step-by-step painting guides. This stands in stark contrast to modern rulebooks from Games Workshop, which are mostly hardcover as a standard, in full color, and are basically 50% art book. The way this book is organized is interesting to me as well. The first 30 pages are dedicated to just explaining the concept of Warhammer, what the hobby is, why you would want to do it, and how to put a model together, what paints and glue to use, how to base your models, even some little bits about how you might make terrain. The reason that this is interesting to me is because in modern rulebooks, there's maybe 1 or 2 pages that explain the concept of Warhammer, because it's just assumed that you know what a miniatures game is if you're picking up this book. Whereas back in the year 2000, it wasn't maybe as familiar of a concept, so they felt the need to explain a whole lot about what the hobby even looks like up front in the first pages of the book. After this, the next 50 pages are dedicated to rules, and the following 50 pages after that are dedicated to advanced rules, followed by about 25 pages of rules on magic. Only after that do we get 20 pages on world building and the lore of the setting. This is interesting to me because in a modern rulebook, like let's say the Age of Sigmar rulebook that comes with Soul Wars, almost the entire first 200 pages out of a 320 page book, that's like 2/3 of the book, is dedicated to the story, the world, the factions, the lore, along with tons of full color artwork and pictures of the models. So you can really see that the priorities have changed, or maybe they could just afford to spend more time on this. But it's just interesting to me that it's almost the inverse. Like back then, there was like 200 pages of rules at the front of the book, and now we have 200 pages of lore at the front of the book. So it's kind of been swapped. I think it really says something about the priorities of Games Workshop at the time, and also probably the priorities of the people who are playing the games. Take from that what you will, it's just kind of an interesting fact. Beyond this, flipping through this rulebook is a little bit alien to me. I don't know a lot about old Warhammer, Old Hammer, the old world, but I do know someone who does know a lot about it, who I think might be a little bit better at explaining what this edition was like. So let's give him a call and see what he has to say on the subject.
Hey Dana, how's it going?
I'm good. So Oculus, I was just thinking, I'm doing an unboxing of Warhammer Fantasy Battle 6th edition, and I was thinking you're kind of old, and you were around during 6th edition, right?
I am both of those things, yes.
Would you mind educating everyone on 6th edition while I go and do some model assembly?
Sure, I've got time. I'm waiting for some lore to defrost in the sink anyway.
All right, well, have fun.
So this artifact of years past that Dana has managed to get a hold of was there during my introductory hobby years. The box that lined the top shelf of one side of the Liffey Street Games Workshop store in Dublin in 2001, the other being taken up entirely by 40k, saving for the specialist games corner for the discerning hobbyist. To this day, it remains very much the aesthetic that I associate when I picture the old world and Warhammer Fantasy battles, because, yeah, it was my first exposure to it, and obviously that's going to leave a mark. That and the box art for the various kits, all done by Adrian Smith, Paul Dainton, Carl Kapinski, and their amazingly talented fellows. The exact type of art to grab you by the lapels and scream, "Look at how cool this fantasy setting is. Have you ever seen goblins that look this incredible?" In 2002, I had been playing Warhammer 40k for about a year at that point, my sci-fi obsessed lonely kid mood drawing me to picking the badass as hell Dark Eldar, until, numerous crushing losses later, I ported to Space Marines because what 13-year-old who can't stop listening to Audioslave does anything just for aesthetics. Fantasy was appealing because, well, it's fantasy. And you know much of everything you need to know if you've read Lord of the Rings as I had, and because did I mention the art? A couple of friends I had played with had their childhood 5th edition armies left over, and while I couldn't make head nor tail of 5th edition rules, 6th edition was cleaner, pared down, and somewhat easier to comprehend. I say somewhat, and I will get to that later. But guess who had just gotten their first big release? I still remember the impact of the White Dwarf that dealt with hordes of chaos. Those big burly boys in spiky armor sweeping down from the north to bring ruin to those guys what did dress like medieval Germans or something. Each god had such a distinct flavor, which was passed off perfectly by the minis. The Lord of Cahorn was a brazen brute, the Lord of Nurgle a decrepit reaper, the Lord of Sinesh, this was a different time. And the Lord of Zinch, oh boy, just look at him. I was sold, and yeah, while the edition lacked regular troops, it reflected the aesthetics of the metal minis, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had a wizard on a disc who was also on fire, and that was badass. The rules, well, the rules were a whole thing. The term usually used for this type of wargame is rank and flank, and while it has its ardent supporters, it's pretty complicated by today's standards. It required diagrams. Lots of diagrams. You had redirected charges, corner-to-corner fighting, flanking maneuvers, lapping around, and all of this before you even got to the advanced rules. But there is something absolutely wonderful about these big block regiments. When you manage to actually pull off that one perfect flank charge, the feeling was like nothing else. This edition borrowed a lot from 40k's 3rd edition, itself having dropped only a couple of years before 6th edition of Fantasy, and it was all for the better. Universal rules referenced in the rulebook, they were now a thing. Scaly skin, breath weapons, and artillery. Just look at this. Look at this. You had rules for a cannonball bouncing. And this was all streamlined from the previous edition. It may seem ludicrous to any of you who only experience fantasy through Age of Sigmar, and it's hard to deny that. Fantasy originally spun out of Dungeons & Dragons, and despite shedding a lot of the frankly insane granular rules it had done 6 editions later, you can still see the hallmarks of it here and there if you've got any experience with D&D. Everything from upgradable weapons to different psychology conditions were here, and yeah, it's undeniably more complicated. But that was also part of the fun. I've no doubt that my teenage brain forgot half the stuff I was supposed to know during the battles that I played, but it triggered a deep nerdish delight when you managed to pull off some super conditional thing, but that was nevertheless a very hard and fast rule, and grab it just out of your head at the right moment. This edition was marked for me by pitched battles where heavily armoured Chaos Warriors went toe-to-toe with High Elf spear phalanxes and Skaven hordes, all the while my Lord of Tzeentch was flying around, scorching everyone with multicoloured fire. I don't think he was broken, exactly, but Tzeentch could easily outmagic just about everyone except Teclis, so it wasn't not broken. It was an edition that felt, well, fluffy. There was still room for flavorful stuff that could be conditional, annoying as hell, and often actively bad for you, but it was so damn thematic. Orc regiments would just sit there beating the crap out of each other. The amount of times a Skaven warp lightning cannon would just spin around when it misfired and end up incinerating a whole battle line of its own army would make me wonder why anyone would even take them, but I think that therein lay the appeal. The fluff was redolent in the rules, and while not to the extent of previous editions, it also managed to work, or at least, does so through the mists of nostalgia. One of the most interesting things to look back on, especially in those days, is how 6th edition was very much a darkening of the overall aesthetics, feel, and lore of the old world. 4th and 5th are a riot of colour, whereas 6th is earthier. Almost all of its art is either in muted tones or just straight up black and white, lending it an appropriately grim, dark character. This extended out to fluff, too. Bretonnians went from being the absolute paragons of virtue to often little more than vainglorious hypocrites lording over leprous peasantry. The Empire leant harder into looking like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Skaven lost their more cartoony elements, like the Doom Wheel, and became this kind of sinister and cancerous threat. The Wood Elves shucked their happier Celtic aesthetic to become altogether more akin to a force of nature, and ogres were elevated from either comic relief or random mercenaries to a fully fledged society that had literally eaten its progenitors. The Tomb Kings even got their own faction, and that Egyptian aesthetic is just perfect. The Warhammer world became overall more creepy, clearly taking notes from what was making 40k so popular, and serving very well to make it distinct from, Tolkien. But sure, it was still Tolkien but darker, but now even more so. It strikes me that a lot of what is considered classic about the old world, and Warhammer Fantasy in general, springs from this particular edition. While the lore was to change in 7th and 8th, and indeed advance terminally, 6th edition laid down a definition for just about every army in the game that was to persist until the end of the system. It was also the last edition to fully introduce new army factions into the game, and the one that truly defined the aesthetic the majority tend to associate with fantasy battles. It was a world where there were magic and monsters, yes, but they were usually dangerous and rare. The power level was a fulcrum that revolved around the everyman, or every orc. This has typically been referred to as low fantasy, and while I often can quibble with the definition, it's hard to deny that the muddy, menacing, and murky woodcut-esque design language that this edition ushered in was era and game-defining for many, myself included. And part of the reason the bright, overflowing with magic world of Age of Sigmar has been so hard to stomach for some. We will, however, always have 6th edition, and I'm certainly grateful for the memories of those high school games of malfunctioning Skaven equipment, infighting orcs, and Lords of Tzeentch on discs. And hey, if you're curious for a piece of genuinely wonderful gaming history, pick up those old army books and have a leaf through them. They're still out there, they're still wonderful. We'll always have 6th edition.
Thank you so much, Oculus. I knew I could count on you for a video like this. Once again, I don't know much about Warhammer 6th edition, so I'm really glad to have someone who was actually there at the time to speak on the subject. If you enjoyed this segment, I would suggest you go and check out his full channel, Oculus Imperia. While he's not a painting YouTuber, he is a Warhammer YouTuber, more so than this channel is, to be honest. On his channel, he takes a detailed look at the lore behind Warhammer 40k from an in-world perspective. When I was first getting into Warhammer 40k a few months ago, his channel was a critical resource for me as a newcomer to the genre, and I would highly recommend you check it out. He also happens to be from Toronto, so as the only two Toronto Warhammer YouTubers, it was just a matter of time before we were going to do a collab. Alright, so while Oculus was keeping you busy, I took the liberty of building all of the models and other stuff in this set, and here's what it all looks like put together. As you can see, it's quite a lot of value for just one box, and I think it looks pretty impressive all assembled. If you're wondering what that orange stuff or blue stuff is at their feet, it's just poster putty. I've used this to temporarily attach all the models to their bases because I didn't want to glue them on yet. I'm not really sure if I want to base these using square bases or whether I might want to put some of these on round bases to use them in Age of Sigmar. Now let's take a look in depth at some of the models. This set comes with 16 orcs with hand weapons, 16 orcs with bows, a standard bearer, a musician, a leader figure, as well as a chariot pulled by 2 boars. The standard orcs come on sprues of 8 each, with 4 melee troops and 4 bow troops coming on each sprue, and they are almost single-piece models aside from their heads, which are separate. I really appreciate the separate heads because it allows a nice degree of customization to make each orc look unique, as well as allowing you to give each orc a dynamic head tilt when you glue it on. I'm assuming in the full range of orcs they typically come in more pieces, and that these are the equivalent of the modern easy-to-build models that come with a lot of the current starter sets, having less pieces than the standard kits to make them a little bit more accessible to a beginner. Overall, I really like these orcs, and I think their sculpts hold up well. After 20 years, I still find these to be compelling models with dynamic poses that I would be happy to paint, and I probably will. After building these, I also completely understand the appeal of square bases, something that I previously found kind of puzzling. The ability to line them up into little units is just very satisfying in a way that it's kind of hard to articulate. You kind of just have to experience it for yourself. The one thing I would say that I found very frustrating when putting all of these orcs together is that they do have a lot of mold lines, especially the archers. And they're made from a slightly different, slightly softer plastic that makes the mold lines a little bit more annoying to remove. And it makes me actually appreciate the modern plastics a lot more and see how the mold lines now are actually quite easy to remove in comparison to these old sculpts. Aside from the standard troops, we have the musician, the standard bearer, and the leader figure, which can be built either with 2 weapons or with a weapon or a shield, and on the back of a boar or on foot. Because I'm me, I've taken the liberty of magnetizing everything so that I would have all of the options available to me. I've also done quite a bit of customizing because I thought for a leader figure he looked a little bit plain. I added this jawbone accessory that was included for one of the chariot drivers. I thought it looked better on the leader figure. And then I also took the face mask that was included as an option for the leader's face, and I glued it on as sort of a belly plate, which I think gives him a little bit more character, and honestly it helps with the magnetization to have a little stabilizing piece down there. Overall, I think the leader is a pretty fun model. Maybe a bit plain compared to how extravagant hero figures have become in recent times, but still pretty cool. The chariot is really fun as well, and it comes with a variety of parts in order to build a really custom, appropriately orky looking chariot. Here you can see some of the parts are still separate in order to make the painting easier because I do plan to paint these in the future. This chariot is cool, but I also find it a bit strange why it doesn't come on its own base. It kind of looks weird that the boars each have their own bases, but the chariot doesn't. Like, I feel like the whole thing should maybe just have one larger base, like we do with modern models. Feel free to educate me in the comments as to why it's based this way. It seems really strange to me. And with that, we conclude our look at the orcs. Overall, pretty cool, and I think I'm quite excited to paint these one day. Let's take a look at their opponents, the Evil Empire. The Empire troops are also pretty cool, but I think I like them a little bit less than the orcs. Their sculpts are fun, but I feel like they don't hold up quite as well as the orcs do in modern times. Much like the Orcs, we get 16 melee troops, 16 ranged troops, a musician, a standard bearer, a leader figure, and a cannon instead of a chariot. Pretty cool. Let's start by looking at the standard troops. Unlike the Orcs, these troops don't have separate heads, so there's not a lot of customization to be done here. Some of the troops are a single piece, while others have a separate weapon or shield piece that needs to be glued on. Overall, I found these to be easy to assemble, and they have way less mold lines than the Orcs, so that's always a bonus. When I was putting these together, I really felt like I was a historical wargamer, like I was putting together these old Renaissance troops with muskets and cannons. To be honest, these models fit right in with any historical army, I think. They don't actually have any fantasy elements to it, from what I can see. Not that that's a bad thing, just an observation. The banner bearer is pretty cool, the musician looks cool, and I actually ended up liking the leader figure quite a bit. Like the orc leader, I magnetized him in order to be able to use all of his options. The only thing here I didn't magnetize was the optional helmeted head because I just thought this head had more character to it and I didn't see the need to have multiple heads. Now let's talk about my favorite model in the Empire set, the cannon. The cannon comes with 3 crew members which can be built in a number of different ways. All of their body parts are modular, so you can mix and match them however you want, which I really appreciate. The cannon itself can be built as a standard great cannon or as a mortar, which is pretty cool. I considered magnetizing this as well, but after looking at the instructions, I found it would have been quite difficult and required a lot of magnets. So I just opted to build the one that I thought looked cooler in this case, which was the Great Cannon. I find this model extremely puzzling as well as compelling, because it's built more like a toy than a miniature. It comes with all these fun little accessories, cannonballs, spare cannonball sticks, a bucket, a barrel, all this extra stuff, but there's no apparent base to put it on. And more than that, the cannon sticks fit into the cannon, so you can actually kind of play with it if you wanted to. The wheels also kind of work. It's very cool, and I like how much of a toy it is, but as a miniature, how are you expected to use this on the tabletop? Are you supposed to build your own base for it, like a scenic diorama with all these pieces? Or are you supposed to field the cannon with all these optional parts just splayed out on your board? I honestly have no idea. It's very strange. If any of you have any insight into this, I would love to know, so let me know in the comments. With all of our models out of the way, let's talk briefly about the last thing that I built out of this box, which is the cardboard terrain. This is quite an interesting piece because I haven't assembled any cardboard terrain in a long time. I think the last time was probably the original Hero Quest, which I got at a garage sale. It was quite a fun thing to put this together, and it's honestly, there's not a lot to talk about. It's a bunch of pieces of cardboard that are held together with plastic framework. It requires glue to put it together, but I didn't glue it together because I thought I might want to use these parts for something later. So it's held together with poster putty like everything else. So overall, I think cardboard terrain is pretty cool. I don't know if I would want to use it on a modern tabletop, but it does have a nice retro feel to it, and I might make a creative project out of this in the future. Thank you so much for watching my unboxing video for the Warhammer 6th Edition starter set. I do plan on painting these models at some point, so if that's something you'd like to see, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Or if you'd like to see more retro unboxings and maybe some retro paint jobs, feel free to subscribe because I'm definitely going to be doing more stuff like this in the future. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of our patrons who make this channel possible. This month, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Grumble Bumpkin, You Win with Win, Jacob Stevens, Gray, Keith Miller, Hanners, and of course, Oculus Imperia. If you'd like to see your name up here, or if you'd like to gain access to any of my bonus content, you can do so at patreon.com/DanaHowell. Or if you'd like to watch my daily painting progress and see maybe if I'm up to anything with painting any of these, you can go and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.